If you have spoken out about gender critical issues at all online, chances are you've been called a TERF. TERF is actually an acronym, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. If you speak against sex work as work, or against that mantra, you might have been called a SWERF, which is less commonly used, which stands for Sex Work Exclusionary Radical Feminist. The RF, or Radical Feminist, has an important history in this fight against gender ideology. Feminists have been involved in combating gender ideology, while unfortunately it is true that it is another set of feminists who ushered it in. So we're going to look at the difference between liberal feminism and radical feminism, the history, my critiques, and the overall context of where gender critical feminism comes from. Alright, so I'm just going to give you guys a heads up. I am not used to doing video essays, like trying to read the shit and then talk. I do understand that I sound like Rain Man, and so, just my apologies. The second half gets a little more saucy, so please stick with it, alright?
My mom know I'm a demon, it ain't nothing she could do but pray for me.
Second wave feminism kicked up after a lull in feminist movements, which seemed to have all but died out once women's suffrage was achieved after the efforts of the first wave movements of the 18th and 19th century of feminism. As we progressed into the second half of the 20th century, feminism began to pick back up after experiencing an abrupt entry into the workplace after the war effort of the Second World War. Once the war was over, women were expected to return to their positions as wife and caretaker, but after having taste of the financial liberation of entering the workforce and a shake-up of women out of the domestic life and into the public sphere, many women decided that they would not return to the exclusive domestic life and wanted to cement their place in public society for once and for all. Thus entered the second wave of feminist action starting in the 1960s, kick-started by the emergence of the first birth control pill to hit the market, which would allow women to plan families and offset childbearing so that they could achieve things like an education and establish a career before becoming mothers, or not become mothers at all. Unlike the relative uniformity of the first wave, second wave feminism found itself splitting into two mutually divergent paradigms: the reformist paradigm of liberal feminism and the deconstructivist paradigm of radical feminism. Radical feminism, on the one hand, emerged as a challenge to liberal feminism, and the tension between the two schools of thought culminated in a split that characterized the divergent movements within the larger movement. On the one hand, liberal feminism, which is rooted in liberalism and socialist democracy, is at its very core seeks to eliminate inequality between the sexes and instead establish total equality between males and females. Liberal feminism focuses its theory and praxis on amending the public sphere, seeking reform within existing structures to amend inequities and bring equality to the sexes. A major facet of liberal feminism is the concept of choice feminism. Choice feminism, in which women are seen as liberated when they're able to make personal choices for themselves within the private sphere without interference from outside forces. Therefore, any choice that a woman makes is a mark of progress and liberation when looking through a liberal feminist lens. On the other hand, you have radical feminism, which means getting to the root. Radical feminism is a Marxist deconstructionist theory which asserts that patriarchy is inherent to every institution of human society, stretching across time and culture, and that it is patriarchy that belies the foundation of all human oppression, and that all other forms of oppression are subsequent and resultant of patriarchy. In other words, it is the male domination of women that creates the very first blueprint for all other forms of class oppression, including racism, classism, etc., and that to address any other form of systemic oppression, we must first and foremost address sexist oppression. and that female sex class solidarity and identity politics supersedes that of any other identity, including allegiance to race, nationality, class, economic class, sexuality, and so forth. According to radical feminism, for women's liberation to occur, there must be a radical reformulation of the entire structure of society, down to the very root, that no institutions are salvageable as they are inherently built to serve male dominion over women, that patriarchy permeates every social dynamic, from the social sphere through and into the private, down to our family structures and our private relationships, and that only through total deconstruction can we build society back with male domination eliminated from every sphere, from the private to the public. Central to radical feminist thought is that private dynamics are always recreated in the public sphere and in public structures. Thus, radical feminism stands on a concept called the personal is political, and that which impacts us personally and our personal structures will always be recreated and in public structures. Thus, if we are to deconstruct the public structures of society, we must first deconstruct private structures. This is a core piece of radical feminist theory and praxis, and thus challenges the virtue of choice feminism in liberal feminist theory, and more on that in a minute. While liberal feminism is rooted in liberal democracy and social democracy, radical feminism has its roots in radical Marxism. So, during the second wave of the 60s and through the 80s, while liberal feminists pushed for equal access for women to enter the public sphere, including in work, government, the corporate sector, and more, radical feminists sought to address the fundamental ways in which the women's oppression takes root in our bodies, our sexed bodies, through challenging heterosexual relational dynamics, domestic life, and reproduction. Again, the personal is political. Thus, during the second wave, liberal feminists focused on reforming existing systems and established equal rights and access to women, such as paid maternity leave for working women, seats in government for women, women's right to access educational opportunities, such as allocating funds for merit-based academic scholarships specifically for women, and more. Meanwhile, radical feminists focused their sights on liberating women from the fundamental source of our oppression, which is the male consumption of our sexed bodies and oppression through control over our reproductive capabilities, beginning, again, with the individual level. And they did this by focusing on abortion access, increased birth control access, legislating against rape, pornography, human trafficking, and the advocacy for the dismantling of heterosexual institutions like marriage and motherhood, and the commodification of women's sex and sex-based labor for exploitation by males, and more. The main split between radical feminism and liberal feminism came to a head during the 1970s of women's sexual liberation, a movement that emerged in response to the development of the first ever birth control pill, which hit the market in the 1960s and had begun to gain traction over the next decade. While liberal feminists embrace the concept of sexual liberation for women, because remember, they believe in equality of the sexes. They wanted men and women to have the same opportunities, even in terms of their sexual choices, to be able to sleep recreationally without concern of pregnancy, much like men. Again, moving closer towards equality of the sexes. This was seen as a major win for liberal feminists who ushered in and celebrated what is known as the women's sexual liberation movement. On the other hand, radical feminists strongly pushed back against the sexual revolution. Anti-pornography pioneer Andrea Dworkin argued that the sexual liberation movement was not truly a feminist movement at all, but rather a hijacking of the movement by men in an insidious attempt to control women's sexuality once again. She said that it was a hijacking of left-wing men who sought to socialize access to sex with women, in departure from their right-wing counterparts, conservative men who wanted to keep the sexual labor of women privatized, thus keeping one woman for one man. Men on the right want to keep the women's sexual commodification a private entity, whereas men on the left wanted to keep women's sexual commodification a public utility. In either case, radical feminists viewed the sexual revolution as anything but a women's liberation movement, but rather a thinly veiled cultural squabble waged by men who sought to define the best way to sexually exploit and commodify women for their own interests. It wasn't liberation for women. Third wave feminism can be most aptly described as the tensions and departures of radical feminism and liberal feminism coming to a head, in which liberal feminism promotes mantras like sex work is work, my body, my choice, and my personal favorite, trans women are women, which underscore the core values of hyper-individualistic relativism, in which one's personal reality determines the world around them, and that it is the world around them that must alter itself to suit the individual's wants, needs, desires, and beliefs. And that their reality, every individual's reality, can be determined by whatever they want it to be. This is relativism. These liberal feminist tenets are met with even more opposition than ever before by liberal feminism's wicked stepsister, radical feminism, the lesser popular, lesser mainstream version of feminism that gave birth to gender-critical feminism. Radical feminists remain rooted in biological essentialism, that our oppression as women is fully connected to our sexed bodies, and our vulnerability to sexual commodification by men, both coercively as through sex work and pornography, and power dynamics of domestication and child rearing, render true consent impossible, as well as violently, such as in cases of rape. Radical feminists view gender ideology and queer theory as the ultimate pivot strategy by liberal patriarchy, in which patriarchy seeks to invade and colonize feminist movements via backdoor access, using transgenderism as their Trojan horse. Radical feminists have shifted their attention from abortion access concerns of the 60s, well, until Roe v. Wade was overturned, but prior to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, to fighting in opposition to gender theory, which radical feminists perceive as the ultimate threat to the movement of feminism and the feminist gains of women since its inception. Additionally, radical feminism pushes back against the sex work is work mantra of choice feminism, which characterizes the core principles of liberal feminism. Choice feminism is a liberal feminist belief that any choice made by any woman is in itself a symbol of progress, in that it symbolizes the very existence of women making choices for themselves. Therefore, liberal feminism seeks to eliminate shame or barriers to any choice a woman makes, including the tradition of the sexual liberation movement. Sexual choices made by women to sexually self-commodify for male consumption are often praised and applauded by liberal feminists. In response, radical feminism critiques this liberal feminist view of choice feminism as deeply flawed because it asserts that any choice made within the context of a patriarchy cannot be trusted as a truly liberated choice, and that through patriarchal programming, women are heavily prone to make choices which further their own subjugation. And so choice feminism must be rejected in this context, as any choice a woman makes related to her sex must be viewed with intense skepticism as potentially being tainted by patriarchal or even male coercion. So what is the opposite of choice feminism? The best way to describe exactly how radical feminists view choice feminism, or the choices of women, is to consider guerrilla warfare groups who have recently led a small nation to victory after living under colonization and occupancy by a foreign entity for many years. After a successful revolution, guerrilla groups often lead with autocracy, handing down firm prescriptions for how one must act. It is considered too soon for democracy, and this is similar to how radical feminists treat women's choices when coming from a patriarchy, that women must be ruled autocratically because they are still damaged from the effects of colonization of men and cannot be trusted with democracy just yet, much like a newly freed former colony. So in order to successfully stabilize and for the vision of the revolutionaries to take root in the new formulation of society, Women must be handed down a formula for how to act and how to behave before they can be trusted to make their own decisions themselves. Again, because every decision they make for themselves has to be viewed skeptically as still conditioned by patriarchy. This is where radical feminism begins to stumble on its own theory after such a strong and coherent opening line of reasoning. For many radical feminists, women cannot be trusted with making their own decisions, as I explained. As such, radical feminists in the most extreme branches believe that only women who have achieved total liberation from men, only these women can be trusted to make liberated decisions, which promote self-interest of herself as a woman, as well as promoting the interests of women as a sex class. Again, the concept of the personal is political can be seen very strongly here. For the most puritanical and militant of radical feminists, the opposite of choice feminism is prescriptive feminism, in which women must trade patriarchal prescriptions for how to act for matriarchal ones, handed down to her by radical feminists' most trustworthy compatriots, political lesbian separatists. Political lesbianism, rooted in Marxism, is sometimes erroneously defined as heterosexual or fem bisexual women who sexually partner with women for political reasons and who actively reject male partners in order to center women politically and even intimately in their lives. This is the purest form of radical feminism, also the purest form of the personal is political. However, I say this is erroneous because the assumption is that only heterosexual women can be political lesbians, and this is false. Radical lesbianism is a form of radical feminism that is practiced by same-sex attracted women, as well as opposite-sex attractive women and bisexual women, all who view their sexuality in terms that go beyond simple personal orientation, and rather they view their sexuality as an extension of their political activism and uses their politics to guide their sexual partnerships. Political lesbians view their lesbianism as a core component of their political identity. This is not to say that all radical feminist lesbians are political lesbians. They're not. Only the ones who center their politics in their personal orientation, or who center their personal orientation in their politics. They view their lesbianism as a core component of their political identity, and it is their homosexuality that serves as the lens through which they view all society and seek to restructure society. This is in no way different than the perspectives of heterosexual political lesbians, except for the convenience of actually being same-sex attracted. Political lesbianism, which despite claims from the radical feminist community, is very much alive and well today in the current movement. Political lesbians view heterosexual offshoots of radical feminism as invalid, such as, for example, female dating strategy. And I'm sure any radical feminist listening to this is probably scoffing and saying, well, that's not an offshoot of radical feminism, but it absolutely is. And to be absolutely clear, when I talk about political lesbianism and radical separatism, which are really sort of interchangeable terms, I am not talking about lesbian feminism. Lesbian feminism and political lesbianism are two totally different things, though they may sort of overlap in some respects, but for the most part, they're separate. Political lesbianism is one of the most extreme manifestations of female separatism. Gender-critical feminism is predicated most fundamentally on the concept of female separatism. Female separatism is something that anybody advocating against gender ideology is advocating for. Yes, even all of the conservative men. What it says is that women are a distinct and specific sex class that has distinct and unique vulnerabilities that are immutable due to their biological reality, and thus should be allocated special spaces and statuses in civic life, in public, and in society. That they should have their own sports teams, that they should have their own private changing quarters, that they should have their own bathrooms, that they should have their own shelters and spaces to meet, things like that. This is separatism. Anyone advocating against transgenderism is advocating for female separatism. However, political lesbianism is the most extreme of radical female separatism. It's saying that women should that should supersede any desire to interact or engage with men at all on both the personal, private, and public level. So it has nothing to do with sexuality. Unlike lesbian feminism, which is about community building, which is about, raising awareness, which is about reaffirming that lesbianism as a sexuality is a legitimate and normal, natural state of sexual existence for adult women. And that, lesbians have unique needs, desires, wishes, and things that they need. And so lesbian feminism is about centering lesbians in their feminism. And that's okay. That is not the same as a political lesbian. You can center your lesbianism in your activism and not be a political lesbian. Being a political lesbian has almost nothing to do with sexuality. In fact, it has nothing to do with sexuality. It doesn't matter if you are homosexual, if you are bisexual, or if you are heterosexual. It is being, opposite sex repulsed is not even a requirement. If you just so happen to be opposite sex repulsed, then all the better. But it is not a requirement. Extreme radical separatists are, by definition, political lesbians. Lesbian feminists are entirely different, centering lesbians and the needs of lesbians and their activism, the same way that someone like me, a midwife, would center mothers, right? Or the same way that Black feminists center Black women. They're two different things. Political lesbians view heterosexual offshoots of radical feminism, such as female dating strategy and more broadly all heterosexual partnerships, as a threat to all female liberation because it believes that female subjugation is inherently recreated in all heterosexual dynamics with men, and that all personal heterosexual dynamics with men of the private sphere are inherently reproduced in the public sphere, and thus any decision that a woman makes privately impacts all women publicly, and therefore all heterosexual dynamics must be rejected universally. Additionally, political lesbianism views heterosexual partnerships as an affront to female solidarity because it views the gains that heterosexual women make from partnering with men as an example of women leaving their sisters behind to personally benefit from patriarchy and relationships with men, and that by entering into such engagements with men, women are reestablishing and reaffirming patriarchal hold, which again is inherent to all heterosexual dynamics or all dynamics between males and females. Yet in their criticisms of heterosexuality, radical lesbian separatists often make the contradictory claim that women are entering into a contract which places them in a position of power over other women. Yet at the same time, they also claim that any woman who enters into a heterosexual relationship with a man places them in subjugation so severe that they are going to live in de facto bondage simply by being with a man. So the contradiction here is that according to political lesbian separatism, that all heterosexual relationships are at once seen as deeply harmful to heterosexual women, but at the same time they are deemed as too personally beneficial to heterosexual women in a way that leaves behind lesbian women and political lesbian separatists and non-partnered women who cannot also benefit from partnering with men in the same way that heterosexual partnered women can benefit. Radical feminists see men to be the ultimate benefactors of patriarchy, and thus radical separatists believe that men who benefit from patriarchy will be willing to share an allotment of their privilege with their chosen woman, so that that woman is placed up on a pedestal, but all other women are left behind. But at the same time, radical separatists say that any relationship with a man is inherently places a woman in bondage. Little contradictory. If radical political separatists see men to be the ultimate benefactors of patriarchy, and any woman who enters into a relationship with a man to also benefit from patriarchy in a way that subjugates her sister. The same then must be true for any woman who chooses to remain loyal and connected to their own fathers. However, we often don't see this sort of critique because ultimately radical feminism is primarily concerned with sexual politics and the sexual decisions of women. But if they are to remain intellectually consistent, then any woman who espouses female separatism on the basis that all men are potentially dangerous to women, and that the personal is political, and that any gains that a woman gets from her relationship with her father has been gained through patriarchy and thus the subjugation of women, and that by engaging in this relationship with this man in private helps to recreate patriarchal systems in public, well, you see the hypocrisy there. Therefore, any relationship with a man, especially a father, would be, by their own standards, inherently anti-feminist, at least from a radical feminist view, and not only anti-feminist, but actively reinforcing patriarchy and harming your sisters as a sex class. The gains that one reaps from such a relationship are only self-defeating and damaging to women as a whole. What radical feminists fail to recognize is the contradiction in their position that relationships with men all inherently lead to subjugation of women, while at the same time denying that there is any one true male nature or female nature, and that our differences start and stop with our bodies. These two competing core values of radical feminism are what lead radical feminists to their own detriment. If radical feminists are to acknowledge that there is in fact no inherent nature of men, i.e. the rejection of gender identities, then they would have to acknowledge that yes, patriarchy is an external system rather than internal. Some men can in fact create egalitarian relationships with women, and as such, like if the personal is political, if egalitarian relationships can be achieved behind closed doors, then those egalitarian relationships can be reperpetuated in society as a whole, adding to the harmony between men and women. It's also important to define what exactly we mean by women's liberation, and I think that that's also sometimes where confusion can happen between extreme radical separatists and women's liberationists. Extreme radical separatists see women's liberation as liberation from men. Other radical feminists see women's liberation as liberation from male oppressions and male patriarchy and the systemic oppression of women. So when we ask the question, is heterosexuality incompatible with women's liberation? Perhaps that was the wrong question, because it depends on what your definition of women's liberation is. If your definition of women's liberation is liberation from men, then yes, heterosexuality is incompatible with women's liberation. Or if you see women's liberation as liberation from oppression from men, and as well as systems of oppression from men in both the private and the public sphere, then no, heterosexuality is not incompatible with women's liberation. And in fact, egalitarian heterosexuality can contribute and promote women's liberation. And in fact, egalitarian heterosexual dynamics in the private sphere can contribute to women's liberation in the public sphere. Additionally, to assert that women are always subjugated and when in relationship to men assumes an inherent weakness and inferiority of women. It also ignores what we know historically, that matriarchies have not only existed in the past, but have flourished. And that patriarchy, when taken in the context of human civilization, is a relatively new phenomenon that correlates with systems of production, particularly the rise of capitalism. And to assume that women are always in a subservient or a subjugated and oppressed position when in relation to men in the private sphere ignores the fact that now we do have technologies to control our reproductive capacity such as birth control. A lot of this theory began in the 70s and the 60s when birth control was a brand new development. We hadn't had a generation that grew up being able to control their own fertility. Women were always at a risk of being subjugated by men. Also, rape was not legislated against. Rape was not seen as the crime that it is seen today. Men could forcefully determine the direction of a woman's life, could literally put her in bondage. De facto slavery by forcing a child onto her, basically a life sentence of now having to serve and give free, unending labor to this child. You have to understand, we didn't have social services before. We didn't have, adoptions were usually done informally through churches and things like that. But if you were a single mother, or if you were coercively pushed into motherhood, you were now forced to serve this child around the clock for its entire natural childhood and beyond. That was enslavement. That was literally male way to enslave women. Another thing is husbands. Again, there was no marital rape. That wasn't a legal term. Men could force their wives to have sex with them, force them on them. And again, prior to the birth control, every act of sex carried with it a risk of pregnancy. Men could impregnate their wives over and over and over again to keep her barefoot, pregnant, tethered to the kitchen, tethered to a subservient role of service and domesticity. We have to evolve with technology. We have to evolve. It's another reason we also need to protect abortion at all costs, so that women are never put in a position again to be put into bondage and coerced servitude by forcing motherhood upon them. But now that we do have ways to bring a more egalitarian system into play where women can control things, where we can, this again, and now that we have, once we can create systems and if we can move away from the nuclear family system and back to traditional extended family ties, it's another way that we have built-in systems that support women even through motherhood, so that they don't have to exclusively be in the domestic sphere. We have to evolve. We once we stay so tethered and clenched onto theories of the 1970s that spoke to a political and social climate of the 1970s, and we don't update that in 50 years, then we aren't speaking to the realities of women. And when we refuse to update our theory and our praxis to reflect the actual lives of women as they are today, then we are doing a disservice to women. When in reality, what is actually at odds is the individualism of capitalism, which dictates that the wealth of the individual is to be kept for personal gain and shared within the nuclear family units, versus radical feminist Marxism that asserts that women have a collectivist responsibility to other women rather than their own families. So when we're looking at two feminist theories of extreme radical separatism and political lesbianism, which again, not to be confused with lesbian feminism, and a heterosexual radical feminist strategy such as female dating strategy, what really is at odds? Because it seems like those two camps, while they actually agree on quite many things, such as the women's sexual bodies, sex should never be commodified as or entered into the labor force as a consumer good for men, that women are defined as adult human females, and that our existence is very much informed by our experience, our biological reality as women and as female women. Where they diverge, again, really comes down to economics. Female dating strategy predicates itself on the libertarian concepts of personal responsibility. that if every single person focuses on making excellent decisions and maintains their own life to the highest quality, and who executes excellent strategy when it comes to family building, when it comes to community building, when it comes to protecting a woman's own best interests, if every single woman does that, then we collectively as a class can be raised up. A woman cannot impact every other woman, but a woman can impact her own life, can have a massive impact on how she does. And this will impact her children and the women around her. It'll give her more resources so that she can contribute to other women, and so that, and more experience that she can share with other women and set a blueprint. On the other hand, extreme radical separatism, it has a very communist, Marxist view. It's about, you must put class identity over personal identity and over personal responsibility, and that you have a responsibility to your class of women over your responsibility even to yourself and to your family. It sort of creates just like a common denominator that we all have to sort of accept and aspire to. It doesn't allow for the individualism of women with different sexualities. It doesn't allow for heterosexual women to create families in a way that speaks to their heterosexuality. It doesn't allow for bisexual women. It doesn't even allow for lesbian women to engage in some of their own. So again, it is less about lesbianism being in conflict with heterosexuality as it is Marxism being in conflict with libertarianism, free market theory of female dating strategy. That when we take personal responsibility, when we use the best of what's available to us, when we choose only the highest value men, when every single woman chooses collectively to make the best decisions for herself and to never give time, attention, sex, and especially not children or commitment to low quality men, this is what's going to help increase women's liberation. That low quality men will have one of two options. They will either be condemned to end their bloodline and their legacy and to live as involuntary celibates, or they will have to evolve and meet the high standards that we collectively as women have set by changing our personal standards as women. And that the women as a sex class are the core identity of all women rather than their identities relative to their own families. That the class solidarity of women as a sex class must come before any other commitments, including the one a woman has to her own family. Her commitments to her family are almost in opposition to her commitments to her sex class because of men's roles and participation, and even male children's roles and participation in natal families relative to the woman. Radical feminism, based on lesbianism, assumes that the inherent status of woman is that of subjugated and oppressed, even going so far as labeling heterosexual intercourse as degrading, wherein the woman is physically submissive and sexually receptive to her male partner and his body, where he must aggressively and forcefully enter her and penetrate her, damaging her body in the process, in a degrading, debased act of barbarism. And even worse, she takes on his genetic material during the act of sex as the receiver. Lesbians and unpartnered women view partnered heterosexual women as being complicit in the patriarchy because they benefit from policies like only men can have a checking account. So what women with husbands benefited from having access to their financial institutions that unpartnered women and lesbians had no way of accessing back in the 60s and prior. So some of these feelings like married women are benefiting from patriarchy at the expense of other women is a holdover from this area in which the benefits of marriage, again, at the time was only a heterosexual institution, gave women special privileges in relation to their men that unmarried women and lesbian women don't have. all of these institutions have been removed. So any benefit that women get from their men is not actually institutionalized, but just a holdover in cultural practices. And again, when I say institutionalized, I mean actually codified in the institution or law or in the policies. I don't mean we just continue to behave in a way that works itself into an institution. I mean literally institutionalized. Women who repeat these mantras that married women are benefiting from patriarchy at the expense of other women are now speaking in more abstract terms because, as I said, the institutional disparities have been removed between heterosexual and lesbian couples with the legalization of gay marriage, and that women no longer need their husbands to access things like jobs or own property or vote or virtually anything else that we do in civic life except for things related to each other, like inherit each other's property. So when radical feminists continue to repeat these mantras like married women are benefiting from patriarchy at the expense of other women, it's just a holdover from this era. Women who repeat these mantras are speaking more in abstract terms, or dare I say, repeating these mantras uncritically and not fully understanding what exactly these pertain to in history and in their historical context. That's the problem with reading texts without consideration for their historical context. It may be strong and persuasive, but it may also not be very relevant to the current political and legal climate. Additionally, saying that motherhood is not feminist has given rise to a growing movement of trad femmes in which women are beginning to recognize that in totally dismantling the traditional familial structures, which has been happening ever since the rise of the sexual revolution, has ushered in a new era of degeneracy. All right, part 2 coming soon.